Hey there nation, and welcome to the show where we help you to play miniatures wargaming on a budget. It is I, Commander Cheapskate, and welcome to the edition of Cheap Shots, the series dedicated to showing you how to save money on the wargaming hobby. And on today's episode, we'll show you how to quickly and cheaply paint a kill team of Cadian Kasrkin for your games of Warhammer 40,000 Kill Team. We will paint these miniatures to a beautiful tabletop standard, and by using the techniques and materials that we suggest, we will help you save over $178.92. So as you can see in this photo, this is what the end result will be for your Kasrkin, and it's going to be brought up to a beautiful tabletop standard. And when you compare this to the materials that you buy from Army Painter as well as Citadel, you're looking at a total cost of $210.49 as opposed to our Cheapskate method, which only costs you $31.57. So with that being said, let's talk about how we can quickly and more importantly cheaply paint up a squad of Cadian Kasrkin. So the first step you have to do, of course, is to assemble your miniatures, and you can assemble them any way that you want to. Now for me, I'm not personally using these miniatures for Games Workshop's Kill Team. I'm actually using them for mercenaries to be used as like NPCs for my games of Necromunda. So I kind of cooked them out a little bit differently than you normally would for your gangs. As you can see, I gave most of these guys all their special weapon options, that way I can trade them out as well. And then once you have them, of course, assembled, the next thing you need to do, of course, is add texturing to the bases. So for the texturing for these bases, I decided to texture using sand and wood glue. I just put some cheap wood glue that I have in my house, and I cover the entire base of where I want to actually have texturing on, and then I dust them with some sand that I get out from my garden from my backyard, because sand is free and the entire planet is pretty much made up of dirt. So because I just do a quick little dusting real quick and let it dry. Now to make sure that the dirt doesn't actually flake off the bases, I actually put a sealant on there, and the sealant I use is a combination of water as well as wood glue. I make a 50-50 mixture, make it kind of like a slurry of wood glue and water, and then I apply it like a wash all over the texturing that I put on top of the base, and I let it sit back and dry. So that way when it does dry, it creates an airtight seal in order to keep that sealant on the bases. And once the texturing is now dry, the next thing I do, of course, is to prime your miniatures. Now, priming is actually a very important step in miniatures painting, and the reason why is because priming actually helps your acrylic paints to adhere to your plastic miniatures. If you were to just apply acrylic paint directly onto your bare plastic miniatures, it doesn't actually have enough surface tension to keep the acrylic paint on, so the slightest bit of friction will cause it to rub off your miniature and ruin the finish of your painting. So because that primer prevents that from happening. Another thing that primer also does too is that the undercoat actually has a large effect on the vibrancy of the colors that you put onto your miniatures. Traditionally speaking, the lighter or brighter the paint job that you want to have on your miniatures, the lighter primer you want to use, whereas the more subdued or darker paint schemes, you go with a darker primer on this one. Now because I'm painting this using a quick painting method using an oil wash, I decided to prime these guys in flat white primer. You can get this at your local Walmart for about $3.50. I just do a quick dusting real fast with this primer all over my miniatures, and when it is dry, we can start working on our base coats. So the first color applied to these miniatures is Pavement by Apple Barrel Paint. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. And I put two thin coats on all the fabric of their uniforms. So if you notice, these guys are wearing like uniforms beneath their armor plating. And the reason why I painted it black is because, once again, I'm not using these guys as Cadians. I plan on using them as mercenaries for games of Necromunda. So I wanted these guys all to match because it's just easier that way. So I decided to use Pavement Paint to do that. It's a nice, beautiful dark gray color that has a nice grit texture to it, which makes it really look nice when you add some dry brushing to it. So I just put two thin coats on all the parts that want to be black on the uniforms, and then I ready to move on for my dry brushing. So the dry brushing I use, of course, is Pewter Gray by Apple Barrel Paint. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. I do a quick dry brush over all the pigment I just painted earlier. Now, dry brushing is a nice painting technique to use in order to create the illusion of depth on your miniatures. What ends up happening is that the pigments catch upon the raised surface of the miniature, creating highlights while leaving that darker undertone in the recesses of the miniatures. So I just do a quick dry brushing real quick with Pewter Gray all over the pigment paint that I did earlier, and I'm ready to move on to my next dry brushing. And for my next step, I do one additional dry brushing with Pale Gray by Folk Art. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 75 cents. I just once again do a quick dry brushing over all the black material that I have on these miniatures, just to add that little additional bit of highlighting. And once that is done, we can start working on the armor panels. So the next step, of course, is to work on the painting of the armor panels for the armor that these Kasrkin are wearing. Now, originally I was going to paint these guys in kind of like a grayish blue color. I was planning on doing the entire squad, but about halfway through painting them, though, I realized it looked kind of boring. I didn't like the way they looked, so I decided to change it up a little bit. bit. So for the officer in the left hand side with the plasma pistol, I originally put him out with 2 thin layers of Tuscan Teal. I did 3 fighters within Sky Blue by Folk Art. You can get those colors at your local Walmart, 50 cents for the Tuscan Teal and 75 cents for the Skyline. And as you can see right here, I decided to kind of change it up a little bit just because it looked a little bit boring and I wanted to make it look more interesting. So I decided to use English Ivy Green from Apple Barrel Paints for the sniper, Palm Leaf Green for one of the guys carrying a las gun. For the Grenadier, I decided to use 2 thin layers of khaki, Tuscan Red by Apple Barrel Paint for the guy armed with the flamer, and lastly Golden Sunset for the guy who's at the yellow armor who's got the multi-gun. And all those paints for those Apple Barrel Paints cost 50 cents at your local Walmart. You just put 2 thin coats on the armor that you want to be that color and you're ready to move on for your dry brushes. Now I do apologize for this next slide because I did forget to take a picture of the dry brushing that I used in the miniatures. So what I did is I just did a quick all over dry brushing with pale gray all over the armor panels I had just done earlier. Now you might be thinking, Commander Cheapskate, why did you do that? And the only reason why I did that is because I was lazy and I just didn't really feel like going through all the different colors to add dry brushing to these guys. So because I just did a quick dry brush real quick with some pale gray just to make it look like it was chipped, weathered, and worn, and then I moved on to my next detail, which is the leather that these characters are wearing. So for like their belts they're wearing, for their harnesses, as well as their gloves, as well as their boots, the slings of their weapons, I picked those all out in 2 thin layers of Territorial Beige by Apple Barrel Paint. You can get this to your local Walmart for about 50 cents. So the next major detail we're working on, of course, are the weapon casings as well as the cloak of the sniper. So for the cloak of the sniper, I picked out 2 thin layers of Peter Gray by Apple Barrel Paint. Once again, you get this at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. As for the las guns and for most of the weapons for most of the squad, I actually picked out their weapon casings in 2 thin layers of Holly Branch by Apple Barrel Paint. It's a nice, vibrant Christmas green color that I like to use for a lot of the weapon casings for our miniatures. I just put 2 thin layers on their weapon casings that I want to have that color. And then lastly, for the guys operating the plasma weapons, I decided to put down in 2 thin layers of Ripe Tomato by Apple Barrel Paint. It's a nice bright orange color and just did 2 thin layers of those weapons. And once that's dry, we're ready to do a dry brush. So the weapon casings that I did in green earlier, I did a quick dry brushing with Lime Sherbet by Apple Barrel Paint. It's a nice pastel kind of green color. Just did a real quick once over the entirety of the weapon casings. And as for the weapons that I did in orange for the plasma weapons, I did a quick dry brushing with Tropic Orange by Apple Barrel Paint as well. These pastel colors can be purchased at Walmart for about 50 cents. So the next detail I decided to work on was actually on the backpack of the little sniper guy there in the back there. So what I decided to do, of course, was the base coat the backpack itself with burnt umber with some 2 thin layers of burnt umber. You can get this to your local Walmart for about 50 cents there. And I also decided to do exactly the same thing, 2 thin layers of moccasin brown for the bedroll that's on top of the rucksack. Now I forgot to take a photo of it again, so I do apologize for that, but I decided to dry brush the backpack with some pale gray as well. And the reason why is because I was a little lazy and I didn't want to use different colors to dry brush the rucksack. And I forgot to take a picture of that step as well. I do apologize for that. And the very last detail we work on before we start moving on to the metallics is the power cables going from the backpacks to the las guns for a lot of these characters. And to bring out that detail, I picked out 2 thin layers of kiwi. It's a nice, vibrant orangish green color that just kind of sticks out directly against the rest of the colors. And for all the cabling and the power cables are running around these characters, just pick that in those 2 thin layers. And once that's done, you're ready to move on to your metallics. So the very first metallic color I decided to work with is Gunmetal Gray by Folk Art, just because it's a beautiful gunmetal color. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 75 cents. And I did this because that silver color is going to be used for pretty much all the characters. So, as you can see, I decided to pick those out for all their weapons, the blades of the swords, the barrels of their weapons, for example. Little beaks like little flashlights are hooked up to their helmets. Also, if you look on the back of some of the rucksacks these guys are carrying, they're also got little power packs as well. So I decided to clean out that entire power pack these guys are wearing for their backpacks in that gunmetal gray color as well. I imagine the rucksacks they're carrying are actually giant energy cells in order to power the hotshot last packs with our guns. So once you figure out what parts you want to be gray, the metallic color on your guys' miniatures, just pick those out 2 thin layers of Folk Art's gunmetal gray. You're ready to move on to your next metallic color. And that next color, of course, is Antique Copper by Anita's Metallic Acrylic. It's a nice bronze color that I use to pick out some of the finer details on the guns. So for example, like the heat shield on the flamer, the magazine of the grenade launcher, the heat shield on the melted gun, as well as a little radar dish on the comms guy in his backpack. I just picked those out 2 thin layers of Anita's Antique Copper. And once I got that done, we move on to our next metallic color. And that color, of course, is Folk Art's Copper by Folk Art. It costs 75 cents at your local Walmart. And I put 2 thin layers of this on the little power packs on the rucksacks these guys are carrying. Like I said before, it looks like these rucksacks are come with kind of an energy pack they use to power their last guns. So for the little battery cells that are on the base of their backpacks, I decided to pick that out in Folk Art. Just did 2 quick thin layers real fast, and then we're ready to move on to our next metallic color. And that color is Emperor's Gold by Deco Art. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 75 cents. A nice, vibrant golden color, and I use it to pick out the small little aquilas that are on these guys as well. So like, for example, on the tops of the helmets, on their weapon casings, on their chests, they also have some of these on their rucksacks as well. And also some of the weapons up here, this symbol kind of appears too. And it's a couple of colors like that just to bring out that additional coloring. And now we're ready to move on to our fine details. So for majority of the miniatures, the fine detail I decided to focus on next were on the lenses of the scopes of their weapons, as well as like little light diodes on their plasma guns. I picked those out of 2 thin layers of Mermaid Blue by Delta Serum Coat. You can get this at your local Walmart, Hobby Lobby for about 65 cents. I did that in order to paint out those lenses on the gun, so that way it kind of sticks out. I also, for the guys who actually had goggles, I decided to pick out some of their goggles in that color as well. The next second detail I decided to pick out as well are some of the little light emitting diodes that are some of these guys' armor. For some of their power packs, they have like little lights that are on their chests, as well as the goggles of the captain as well. I picked out 2 thin layers of King's Gold by Apple Barrel Paint. Just put a little dot of yellow for those lenses, as well as for those little power pack buttons on their uniforms, and you're ready to move on. And the last detail I decided to pick out was on the lenses of the the flashlights that are attached to their helmets. I picked out 2 thin layers of Nita's acrylic True Red, just a little dot of that red color directly onto the flashlights on their helmets to make it look like there might be little targeting scopes or little flashlights or whatever. Just adds a little bit of detail in order to make it a little bit more interesting. And now that we're done with the miniatures for the most part, the next thing we need to work on is on the texturing on the bases. So I'm just going to go for your typical kind of like urban kind of wasteland type of base that I usually use for all my Necromunda miniatures when I use texture bases like this. So to do that, I just put a single thin layer of pigment directly on top of the bases. Now you'll notice some of the white primer is kind of sticking through the coat of paint. That's going to be perfectly fine though, because we're going to dust these things down with some dry brush with some grays anyways, so it's just going to add to the overall effect. And the first layer of dry brushing they do, of course, is Pewter Gray by Folk Art. I put 2 thin coats on the little rock that the sergeant is standing on. Then, of course, I dusted the entire base with Pewter Gray. Just a quick little dry brush there. And then once again, I just do a quick little dry brush again with Pale Gray by Folk Art, so that way we can bring a lot of those details out for that texturing, so it makes it look amazing. And once we're done with that dry brush, the next step, of course, to do is an all-over oil wash. So for this next step for my oil wash, I use Minwax Polyacrylic in Mission Oak color, and I apply it like a wash all over the entirety of the miniature as well as the base as well. And the reason why I use this oil wash is because it does exactly the same thing as Army Painter Strong Tone, except that it only costs $7.99 a can as opposed to the $30-something that Army Painter charges for their product. Don't get me wrong, Army Painter does a beautiful job, it's just that it's a little too expensive for me, so that's why I like using the Minwax. So once again, you just paint this like a wash all over the entire of the miniature, and it does a couple of things for us. The first thing it does, of course, is that it seeps directly into the recesses of the miniatures and brings out a lot of the details that we couldn't see before. Things like the gaps between the individual armor panels, the folds of the fabric, the individual textures on the base, the grooves along the weapons. It looks amazing and brings a lot of those details by seeping into those recesses. The second thing it also does as well is it also smooths out the transitions between our dry brushing as well as our base coating. As you can see, that chalky pastel appearance is now gone because its colors have now blended together. It makes a more organic looking highlight for our miniatures. And the last thing the oil wash also does as well is it also mutes down the vibrancy of our colors, and instead of being that technicolor bright color it was now, it actually draws it down. And that's the reason why I use such bright colors in the very beginning of this painting process, because that Minwax is going to darken down the vibrancy of those colors. Now, of course, you gotta let this stuff dry and cure for about 24 hours because it's not only a stain, but it also has a polyurethane as well. It's gonna give it a nice high gloss finish afterwards. It's gonna protect your miniatures from weathering, fading, as well as from chipping. Now, the second to last step, of course, is to paint the rim of the bases. In this case, I use 2 thin coats of Skyline by Folk Art. It's a nice grayish blue color that I use for all the skirmish miniatures in the students' collection, just because those skirmish games usually take place in urban environments, and I think it's a nice contrast to use for the terrain that Iron Major makes on our channel. So I just put 2 thin coats of Folk Art directly onto the base, and once that dry, we move on to our very last step, which of course is optional. And that final step, of course, is to put a matte varnish on the miniatures. Now, this step is completely optional. The reason why I like to use a matte varnish spray is because the Midwax polyacrylic actually has a high gloss finish on your miniatures when you're done letting that dry and cure. I don't care for that high gloss finish. I like more of like a matte finish on my miniatures. So I take a can of Krylon matte varnish spray. You can get this at your local Walmart for about $5.99. I just dust them real quick with a matte varnish spray to reduce the sheen off of that high gloss coat, and they're ready to move on. Obviously, if you like that high gloss, the sheen on your miniatures, you could of course skip that if you want to. And once again, here is the end result of our miniatures. As you can see, they're done to a beautiful tabletop standard. They look absolutely fantastic, and you can use them in your games of Warhammer 40,000, or in my case, I'm going to be using for my games of Necromunda, whichever one applies to you. So now that we're done talking about how we paint these guys up, let's talk about the shopping list you'll need to purchase from Army Painter as well as from Citadel Workshop in order to actually paint your miniatures the same way we did, but using their products instead. So if you want to achieve the same results we did, but using Army Painter and Citadel instead, these are the materials you need to buy. You need to buy a can of Corax White Spray, which costs $17, as well as Asherwrath Red for $7.80. You also need to buy Thunderhawk Blue, Averland Sunset, Militarum Green, Vulcan Green, Caliban Green, Luganeth Orange, as well as Cyberite Green, and all those colors will cost you $4.55. You need to buy a pot of Wildwood, which is going to cost you $7.80 for that, as well as Morghast Brown, Baylor Brown, Moot Green, Slaanesh Grey, Eshin Grey, Troll Slayer, and those are going to cost $4.55 a piece as well. You also need to buy a pot of Talisar Blue for $7.80, as well as Mephiston Red XV88. Those two cost $4.55, as well as Brass Scorpion, Lead Belcher, Screaming Bell. Those cost $7.80 for those. Rust Grey, Ulthuan Grey for $4.55, Retributor Armor for $7.80 as well. You also need to buy a can of Army Painter Strong Tone for $32, as well as a can of Minotaurian Varnish for $19.50. You also need to buy Army Painter Basing Set to texture miniatures for $18.99, as well as Citadel PVA Glue for $12.50. So assuming that you're purchasing all these materials for the very first time, you're talking about a grand total investment of $210.49. And when you compare that to the Cheapskate method of $31.57, we end up saving you a grand total of $178.92. So there you guys have it. This is a good way for you to help you save over $178 on your miniature painting if you decided to use some generic cheap materials from craft paints from like Walmart and Hobby Lobby to paint up your miniatures as well. And as you can see, we actually achieved similar results by spending a lot less money. So if you're looking for a way to save money in these inflationary times, might I suggest using some cheap craft paint to paint up your miniatures, because it does exactly the same thing for a fraction of the cost. So that's good for this week, guys. As always, please feel free to like, comment, or subscribe. Your guys' input is invaluable to us as always. Also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, as well as blogger.com for all the greatest hobby news related to this channel. That's good for this week, guys. I'll catch you guys next one. Peace out and stay classy.